In philosophy, there is a rhetorical device known as Hume's fork, named after its author, David Hume. Essentially, what this device does is divide all truth statements up into one of two types, either matters of fact or relations of ideas. Put more simply, it divides assertions into either abstractions or concrete things, Plato's forms versus Aristotle's empiricism. The basic idea behind Hume's fork is that any true statement one could make about a particular thing must fit into one of these two camps, and, most importantly, you cannot cross the streams. For instance, say I were to talk about a perfect circle. As an idea, we can easily imagine such a thing existing in some perfect Platonic state. However, you cannot point to any instance of a perfect circle in real life. No matter how seemingly perfect it might appear, if you zoom in close enough, you will find jagged imperfections. Likewise, I can easily draw an object that I might call a circle, but no matter how carefully and skillfully I draw it, it will never be as perfect as the one in my imagination. There will always be some unrefined edge, even at a microscopic level. Hume's fork has many practical applications, in highlighting the disparity between ideals and their real-world counterparts, from math to art to science to social systems. In a similar fashion, I have constructed a rhetorical tool of my own that I have affectionately dubbed Marushia's fork. Unlike Hume's fork, however, mine has 3 prongs instead of 2, which is how you know it's superior, and the simulation smiles a synchronistic symbolic smile upon me. The 3 prongs of Marushia's fork are as follows: statements of fact, moral judgments, aesthetic preferences. Much like Hume's fork, this is meant as a way of separating statements by type, though not strictly by their truth value, so much as by the level of pathos each commands, ranging from most to least. The idea being that people often respond with defensiveness or outright hostility because they inappropriately conflate these concepts, whereas if we take a step back and examine them in isolation, we might better come to understand what's being said, and hopefully bring down the temperature of the discussion to something approaching civility. I'm probably not the first person to make this particular division before, but I submit it to you anyway, in the hopes it might be used to take a stab at people's true intent without needing to invoke mind reading, and without the disastrous results that come from crossing the streams. Some examples might help. If I said that Socrates is a man, that is a statement of fact. I am framing a particular idea in terms of its truth value, and whether it is true or false, relying on the fundamental nature of reality itself to determine the answer objectively. If I said Socrates is wise, that is a moral judgment. I am framing a particular idea in terms of its ethical value, and whether it is good or bad, relying on a code of conduct and behavior principles to navigate a particular outcome. Such statement might be objective or subjective, depending on the context used and how the system is set up. If I said Socrates is awesome, that is an aesthetic preference. I am framing a particular idea in terms of the subjective value, and whether it's something I would rather engage with or not, with such desires stemming from the intersection of my own nature and nurture. Let's take another example. If I said, Bob weighs 500 pounds, that is a statement of fact. I could also say that being 500 pounds carries with it certain health complications, and that would likewise be a statement of fact, for its reliance on cause and effect. Statements of fact are either true or false, and can be objectively verified without bias or prejudice. This is the essence behind things like the scientific method and logical reasoning. There is nothing personal about them, and people ought not to invest any emotional attachment or identity into them, any more than they would with regards to the statement 2 + 2 = 4. They are merely the nature of how things are, and it's left to us to decide how best to make use of that information to achieve a particular end, based on our own values and preferences, as covered in the other 2 prongs. Statements of fact are amoral and neutral. Maybe we disagree on the facts, in which case the proper realm of discussion would be to remain on this same prong, rather than to accuse the other person of being an immoral, racist, sexist, fascistic, communistic, hate-filled, science-hating liar, or any other such ad hominems along this line, as is unfortunately so often the case these days in modern discourse. That applies to people of all demographics and tribes. Such personal attacks cross the streams between facts and morality by attributing motive to the person, often relying on mind-reading to divine that they're somehow dishonest, when the simplest explanation for any difference of opinion is that they're just innocently mistaken or misinformed or naive, or possibly even looking at the situation in a different way. Many of you probably know that David Hume is also well known for his famous law that says that you cannot derive an ought from an is, meaning you cannot cross statements of fact with moral judgments. Continuing in our example, if I said that Bob should lose weight, that is a moral judgment, because I'm now moving from the objective to the subjective, by valuing Bob's health and well-being over its absence. In this case, it's subjective because there are two ways to look at this. If we agree on the moral judgment, that is, we agree on the principle, the underlying goal, the foundational value, then it's simply a matter of returning to the first prong to determine the optimal solution. Whereas, if we disagree at this level, we have to remain at the second prong and resolve the moral conundrum. Usually this requires digging down to first principles and finding a contradiction. For instance, Bob might say he's happy with how he looks, but is that really true, or is he just rationalizing? Is he merely arguing from laziness, or convenience, or inability, or ignorance, or some other mental or physical resistance that he's unwilling or unable to recognize? If he could snap his fingers and lose the weight without effort, would he still feel the same way, or would he leap at the opportunity to change? This I often find is a useful test for getting at a person's true desires, because you can tell a lot more by how they act than by what they say. Depending on how Bob feels about himself and his circumstances, he might agree that he needs to lose weight and use my comment as fuel to motivate himself to change his behavior. Or, alternatively, he might get defensive and think that I'm hurting his feelings and attacking his identity, even in spite of my sincere well wishes for him. Maybe he has reason to think that I'm misinformed. For instance, if I'm hallucinating his weight and he's actually very well fit. Maybe he has reason to doubt my motives based on the past actions of others who would only bully him for it, or because I, on other occasions, had not been so honest. So, the facts of what he should do in either case ultimately rest upon the outcome he desires for himself. Those of you savvy folks are probably already thinking about the social implications of this example, and the sort of cultural debate that's formed around things like body positivity and fat-shaming, etc. This is just the start of how such a rhetorical tool might be useful. Ultimately, since Bob's actions here aren't affecting anyone but himself, it's his choice whether to act upon the advice to lose weight or not. However, either way, he cannot escape the reality of the consequences of his choice. That to not act will in fact result in detrimental health effects eventually, whether he cares to accept it or not, and regardless of how much he cries that the doctors are biased or evil or abusive. Mother Nature simply doesn't care. Conversely, we can imagine a situation in which Bob's health does affect others. Supposing insurance companies refuse to offer him health insurance unless he drops the weight or otherwise pays a higher rate to cover the added risk. The company claims it will more likely be forced to pay out due to Bob's increased chance of succumbing to some ailment as a direct result of his weight, so they wish to offset their losses. To wit, they view Bob as a potential risk. That is a moral judgment, albeit one that takes into consideration the statements of fact. It's subjective in that the company values profit over loss, and technically so does Bob, since he also doesn't want to pay more than he feels he absolutely has to in this situation. Here again, maybe Bob feels as though he's being treated unfairly, because his own personal considerations and priorities are different from those of the company. He naturally views himself through a human lens, whereas the insurer views the issue through the lens of corporate finances. Our own sympathies in this particular example might shift depending on which situation we find ourselves in, whether we are in Bob's position or his insurer's. I know it might be tempting for some of you to take a hard position one way or the other on that, but for the sake of this thought experiment, just take a minute to try and imagine yourself in the other party's shoes and how you'd react in that instance. If you were rejected based on your physical characteristics, or if you were the one forced to pick up the tab, how would you feel in that moment? Again, we might have a disagreement as to the specific health effects and their likelihood and their associated costs, but either way, that would be best kept on the prong of facts, countered by further reason and evidence, without invoking the pathos that is best reserved for moral judgments, such as fear and anger, or for aesthetic preferences, such as pleasure or disgust. Maybe in this example, Bob chooses not to engage with the insurance company, and instead demands the government provide health care as a human right. Here he is making a moral judgment. And supposing that I, in turn, as a citizen, don't want my tax dollars going to pay for Bob's unhealthy lifestyle choices. That again would be a moral judgment. My point is not to get stuck in the weeds of this particular issue, but to use it as a vehicle to show how to apply the tool in practice. Just from these two prongs alone, we can glean a great deal of insight into the way discourse is handled. Assuming we both agreed on the facts and morality of the situation, however, there is still one more prong by which we can take a stab at this hypothetical. For instance, if I said I don't want to have sex with Bob because his obesity disgusts me, and I prefer men with chiseled abs, that is an aesthetic preference. Much like moral judgments, one's aesthetic preferences might result in hurt feelings, since when we invest time, energy, emotion, and identity into something, if people reject it, we often feel as though they are rejecting us. Spiritually, you could say we have projected a portion of our soul into our work, our beliefs, our views, our stuff, our relationships, etc. That is why they're called our possessions. However, it's important to point out that aesthetic preferences are not the same as moral judgments, and that the failure here is in investing too much of our identity into something that is actually independent of our moral character, who we are as a person. Case in point, in our current example, Bob might be the nicest, most compassionate, most morally righteous person alive. That can be true at the same time that I find him physically repulsive and don't want to have sex with him. Or maybe it's the case that I don't swing that way, or he's too short and I only date tall guys, or I don't like his eye color, or think he has a stupid haircut, or something along those lines. These are two separate prongs that have nothing to do with one another, but we often conflate them and associate the one with the other. Here again, we touch on deeper socio-political issues, like fat-shaming and body positivity, among others. Whereas it might have been the case that all Bob had to do was hit the gym and start a keto diet to lose 300 pounds, thus altering his personal aesthetics, he instead crosses the streams and takes such statements as moral judgments of his character. Consequently, he develops self-loathing and resorts to binging on ice cream and soul food to comfort his pain, because he knows in his heart he's a moral person and doesn't understand why others can't see it, even though I freely admitted it before. He doesn't understand because he's experiencing cognitive dissonance, and this just creates a downward spiral into hell, and he winds up killing himself either through suicide or heart disease. Contrast this to some dreamy hunk with a heart of darkness, a sort of Gaston-type character. Basically the exact opposite of Bob, someone who meets the aesthetic criteria but is morally reprehensible and should be called out for it. In either case, I think shame can be a useful motivator for correcting undesirable behavior, whether moral or aesthetic, but only if it's applied along the right channel. Otherwise, it can easily backfire to disastrous results. People often misunderstand or even outright forget the phrase, "Judge not by the color of one's skin, but by the content of their character." Taken in larger context, it's a separation of moral judgments from aesthetic preferences. Much like statements of fact, aesthetic preferences are amoral and neutral. If you happen to like pizza and someone else doesn't, that's perfectly fine. Agree to disagree, and learn to live and let live. But imagine how insane it would sound if someone said, "You don't like pizza, therefore you're a bad person." The same is true for your various preferences in art, food, music, attire, whether you wish to have in-group preferences for race, gender, sexual preferences ad nauseum. Who really cares about any of that stuff if it's not affecting you or anyone else? We often use the word discrimination in a positive sense when we're talking about someone as having a sense of standards or refined taste. Yet people get easily triggered when the same term is applied to their interactions with human beings. I would argue this is because they often conflate such personal preferences with moral judgments, when in reality we all discriminate, and if you think you're some exception to that, I'm sure I can find some combination of characteristics in a single person that you'd personally find completely reprehensible, and wouldn't want to be tethered to, even if they were the last person on Earth. And I'm not just saying that about superficial characteristics either, though for some of you that would certainly apply. Perhaps the only real difference is in which dimensions you discriminate, and to what degree. How tight or loose you are with certain chosen or unchosen characteristics. Again, everyone does it. It's part of being human, and there's nothing wrong with that. You might disagree with a person's personal preferences, and that's also fine. It's all part of personal autonomy, freedom of choice, and freedom of association, things we used to ascribe to as being liberal values. The only time that should really matter is when discrimination results in the denial or violation of a person's human rights, which, that's a whole separate discussion on what is and isn't a right. When freedom of association and freedom of choice get corrupted, and turned into forced association and forced choice against an individual's will. Of course, by then you've wandered back to the prong of moral judgment again. As I said before, I'm not looking to get into the weeds on this or any other specific issue within the context of this video, but hopefully you get the overall point I'm trying to make, that there's a difference between statements of fact, moral judgments, and aesthetic preferences. I'm sure you can probably think of many more situations in which to apply this type of triage, but hopefully you found this model helpful for breaking down conversations and analyzing them. If you can figure out which prong your opponent is on, you'll know how exactly to apply yourself to provide an effective and productive counterargument. Many bad things, from logical fallacies and flame wars to outright tyranny and genocide, are the result of crossing the streams of this fork, applying conclusions derived from one prong to another, and often through hasty generalizations. I'll leave you with this last little thought experiment. You're part of that group, therefore you're bad, and I don't want to associate with you. See how many examples you can think of that would fit this structure, and how you might apply Marushia's fork to successfully dismantle and overturn it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you found this useful. Until then, take care, Thelemites.